maybe I'll just say a few words about how this book-length poem came to be. I direct the international writing program at the University of Iowa, and one of my obligations in that role is to serve as a cultural envoy. And so over the last 20 plus years, I have had the good luck to travel to do cultural diplomacy missions in over 50 countries. One of the early ones I did was quite interesting. That I got an email one day from somebody I knew at the State Department. I do this cultural diplomacy work because my program was funded largely by the U.S. State Department, and I got an email from somebody who, at the time, I did not know very well. I knew what his role was at the State Department, and the subject line said, "Call me about your trip to Kyiv." And I thought, what is he talking about? I called him up and I said, what trip to Kyiv? And he said, you're going there in 3 days. Well, that's a surprise. So on 3 days' notice, I flew to Kyiv, which in those days we called Kiev, the Russian pronunciation of the word. And what happened was I was put into an unheated van in the coldest winter in memory, and with another Ukrainian novelist, a woman who had been in my program a few years before, and evidently she and the embassy had cooked up this idea of this cultural diplomacy mission, and we started driving west to Lviv, and as I said, it was the coldest winter in memory, and the Foreign Service National, that would be the cultural specialist at the embassy, Ukrainian woman, was clearly going through menopause because every few minutes she would roll her window down, having suffered a hot flash, and it was so cold in that van that the Ukrainian novelist and we took out all of our clothes from our separate suitcases and duffel bags and covered ourselves with clothes, trying to stay warm, because it was just, I don't think I've ever been so cold. And at a certain point, I thought, just to take my mind off of how cold I was, I started making some notes about what I was seeing as we were driving west. And I was thinking a lot in those days about the marvelous poem by Adam Zagayevsky, To Go to Lvov, the old name of the city, or the name of the city in the Soviet times. And it's a really beautiful poem, and I'm a huge fan of Adam's work. And so I was driving west, thinking about Adam Zagayevsky, and kept writing lines and writing lines. And when I came back from that mission, I worked at the poem a little bit here and there, and then there was the Maidan Revolution in 2014. So we put together another cultural diplomacy mission to Ukraine. This time I went to Kyiv and then to Kharkiv, two cities much in the news these days, and kept writing lines about it and thinking, gee, I wonder if there's something more to this. And years went on. Adam Zagayevsky got sick and died, and that inspired me to write more lines about him. The poem seemed to be growing, and then, of course, on February 24th, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, the war that we've been watching over these last 2+ years. That happened also to be my 65th birthday, February 24th. So the date at which you were conventionally thought to retire was, for me, that became the spur to write ever more on this poem, until eventually I got to a certain point and I thought, it may be a whole book. I passed it along to my friend Askov Melnichuk. He and I were both working on the Ukraine coordination group for the Artist Protection Fund, so we were in conversation quite a lot. And I sent him the manuscript just as thinking that he, as a Ukrainian American, might be interested in my take on it. Some hours later, he called me. He called me and he said, "I want to publish it." Oh my gosh! Okay, well. Meantime, separately, a dear friend of mine, a diplomat, Nina Murray, great poet and translator from Ukrainian, translated the poem into Ukrainian. And then it was also translated into Russian. So now I have this poem that exists in English, Russian, and Ukrainian. And I suggested to Askell, I said, what if we publish the book en face with in Ukrainian? That would be, we have never had anything like that in our literature. And so he agreed to do that. And that's how it came to be. So maybe what I'll do is just read you a little bit from the start of the book, so you'll get a taste of it.
Great.
It's on the road to Lviv, and it's in memory of Adam Zagaevsky. And I'm just hoping I can see this print. Yeah, the globes of mistletoe in the bare trees, in an irradiated area west of Kiev, a silent colony of children signing prayers in unison, and gloveless women hauling sleds of kindling along the icy path by the soccer pitch on which the SS shot the Jews, and murders of crows clearing the road of carrion, save for the wolf splayed on a drift of snow. The miles unroll in an unheated van past wheat fields, woods, and telephone poles topped with empty stork's nests spreading out like mitres. In every village, there is a new church crowned with a green dome, onion shaped and layered, with murals of the Savior resurrected beyond the statues of the fallen order, of planes and tanks, of a seminarian scorned by his classmates and a novelist crippled in the Great War, of the Red Rider spurring his horse to fly toward a ladder nailed to a cross outside a cemetery embellished with blue, green, and orange banners, then castles, cattails, and horse-drawn carriages in which the children huddle under sheepskins, and a pack of stray dogs loping across the road, and tractor trailers sliding down the hill. So much for gauging what a traveler from the Empyrean can document with his own eyes at 30 miles an hour. Oh, fickle muse of history, I cannot imagine or invent lives for the peasants glimpsed in this dream of war and independence. Somebody must repair the train, the bridge, the iconostasis hacked to pieces by a believer who lost his only son to cancer. Somebody must draw a map to the statue of the Virgin in a village cleansed of its original inhabitants, where a peasant arguing with a young priest over the deed to the cathedral raises his fist and the barracks empty at daybreak, a scene derived from a 19th century novel refracted through a diplomatic lens. Why are we driving to the western border, not to Odessa, birthplace of the brilliant Anna Akhmatova and Isaac Babel? Natalia, the Foreign Service national, who rolls her window down with each hot flash and will not roll it up again until I cloak myself with clothes from my duffel bag, ignores all questions deemed political, including venues, meals, accommodations, and Russia's near abroad, i.e., Crimea, the Baltics, Belarus, and anywhere one Russian nationalist can be found. And now flip on to a little bit further. Nor can I fathom what our mission is, since cultural diplomacy is not easily defined. And so I turn again to Adam Zagaevsky's poem, recounting an imaginary journey to his birthplace, Lvov, in what was once Poland, then Soviet Ukraine, and now an independent country in the crosshairs of irredentist Russian politicians and democratic-minded Westerners like me, who are determined to develop civil societies around the world, utopians, in other words, who may wreak havoc in a quest to undermine the power of authoritarians to dictate what their people must believe in order to survive. Impossible, of course, yet here I am east of Lviv with my teeth chattering, and my divided heart imagining scenarios in which I do not have to risk my life to satisfy the foreign policy imperatives of a regime at war in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other lands, which rarely merit mention in the news. And then one more short section here. When Dostoevsky read at Vilenica in the courtyard of a medieval castle that fell to ruin long ago, to the poets seated beneath a chestnut tree, which rained ripe chestnuts on their heads at intervals no one could time, their attention may have wandered, for they kept looking up as if in prayer, since poetry is prayer. This festival in the karst region of Slovenia brought kindred spirits from around the world to revel in the word made manifest. Here in the courtyard and later in a cave the organizers called their tectonic cathedral. Say amen to the poets then, who savor a blaze of words under the chestnut tree. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much.
Happy to discuss, take questions, whatever you like.
Well, I'll jump in first, Christopher. You had this marvelous line, poetry is prayer. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, well, just maybe I'll use it as an occasion to flip in a little bit of my biography. I did cover the wars of succession in the former Yugoslavia in the early to mid 90s. And when I finished that book, I wrote a pair of books about it. One, a short book called The Old Bridge, the Third Balkan War and the Age of the Refugee. And then a longer book about my travels through all the war zones called Only the Nails Remain. It comes from a famous poem by the Slovenian poet Tomáš Šalamun, Scenes from the Balkan Wars. But when the war was over, I found myself pretty much destroyed physically, psychically, spiritually. And so I began I undertook a series of pilgrimages to the holy mountain of Athos in northern Greece, the monastic republic of Mount Athos, and ended up writing a long book about that called Things of the Hidden God, Journey to the Holy Mountain. And it was during that period, while I was in some ways just trying to figure out how to live my life, I began to think about the close connection in my mind, at least between poetry and prayer, particularly in, let's say, as someone who loves the Psalms and Proverbs, as well as the poetry of Czesław Miłosz, Zadajewski's countryman, who often employed that line from the Psalms, a line that you also find in Walt Whitman, the verset. I remember I asked Czesław about that once, where he got that line. I was thinking that he got it at least partly from Whitman, though he would not admit to that. He just looked at me and he said, from the Psalms, obviously. And I think if you are a poet who has the music of the King James version of the Psalms in your ear, that becomes a natural kind of connection. And I also think of prayer less as a petition to the gods, as a way of opening oneself to whatever might be coming down through you through the gods in conventional Christian terms, but as a poet through the language itself. It has always seemed to me that poetry depends upon making oneself open, vulnerable, available. Hence my love of things like surrealist automatic writing, chance operations, anything that will short circuit the logical ways in which the mind might think. I think of myself as trying to be open to what the language might have to offer, in the same way that in prayer one might make oneself available to whatever God might wish to how they might wish to use you. And then I also, John Donne is an absolute essential poet for me. I think of all those gorgeous love poems he writes early in his life, and then once he becomes the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral of London, he starts writing those holy sonnets, which are equally beautiful, and the connection between or his understanding of desires and the ways in which desire changes over a lifetime is close to the way I think about my walk here below as well.
Mm. Well, just following up on that last part of what you said, Christopher. I mean, what is? Give us a glimpse of the cartography of your own desire. I mean, where are you now? What do you desire at this 67 years old? I guess you must be now.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is, I've published two books of poems in the last couple of years, which is sort of funny. I hadn't published a book of poetry since 2013, and I've been writing an awful lot of poems. I had literally hundreds of pages around, and I think that's largely because I have a biography due to turn in at for Norton on uh, the well, let's say 17th century divine Roger Williams, uh, who was I found out about 10 or so years ago that he was my first ancestor in the New World, and when I discovered this, my late father had found some old paperwork, including some things that his grandmother had left behind. His grandmother was quite an eccentric woman. She wrote a book about the New World Order in the 1920s, which was pure gibberish. And nobody, of course, would publish it. So she used the last of the family money to uh, buy a publishing house and printed this book, which then, of course, nobody would buy because it was so terrible. So she sent her then second husband driving around the country to drop off copies of this book in in libraries, and we had a copy in our house. And for sometimes at dinner, my father would bring it, pull it down, and read a couple of sentences because it was just pure madness. She was a sort of a right wing kook, if you will, and so among those things, at a certain point, she decided she wanted to become a daughter of the American Revolution, a very right wing organization, and a member of the Colonial Dames of Providence and Rhode Island, an equally august institution for which she had to put together, or she had somebody put together for her a genealogy. And so I'm reading through the one about the Colonial Dames of Providence. I'm going back and I'm seeing all these names that I know vaguely were congregational ministers mostly. Um, and then I get back to the very first one. It was Roger Williams. And I said to my father, we're actually related to somebody kind of interesting. And then I started to research Williams's life, and he turned out to be just kind of fascinating. We think of him now as the guy who founded Rhode Island, but what he did was there was so much that was interesting about him. He was a very devout man. Grew up in London at the age of 14 when he was uh, in church one day. The most famous jurist of the day, Sir Edward Coke, who was in charge of the Star Chamber, saw him taking down the sermon in dictation. He knew shorthand. So he hired Williams at 14 to be his eyes and ears in court in the Star Chamber because he was on the outs once again with King James at the time. So Williams gets a kind of an education at an early age in the law, goes to Cambridge, does a PA, then does an MA, refuses to take orders because by then he's become a very devout Puritan. So he goes to the New World and is immediately offered a position in the First Church of Boston, turns it down because he doesn't think the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony are pure enough. I mean, they're not separated enough from the Anglican Church. So he goes to Plymouth and he goes to to Salem, bounces back and forth. And along the way, he's a great linguist. For example, he tutored John Milton in Dutch when Milton was the secretary for foreign tongues. He may have tutored Milton in Hebrew as well, but in the New World, he learned the Narragansett language. So he came to believe that since, in his view, King Charles and King James, neither one were the true vicar of Christ on earth, they did not actually have title to the Aboriginal lands in the New World. And what Williams was saying was, look, this is the Indians' land. It doesn't belong to the king. So that's the main reason he was eventually banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony. In fact, he was going to be shipped back to England, where he would have faced really severe physical abuse, split tongue, lopped off ears, and probably executed. But the very man who banished him, uh, uh, John Winthrop, governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, tipped him off that he was about to get arrested by the militia in the middle of the winter. And Williams just takes off. He had been in his sickbed for about 6 weeks, goes off into the woods and stays with the Indians for the next 14 weeks. And they were happy to accommodate him because he knew their language and he traded with them and he liked to share stories with them. So he escapes, he founds Rhode Island. 6 years later, he goes back to England to secure a royal patent for it. And on the way back to England, he writes a book that looks like a phrase book of the Narragansett language. It's called A Key into the Language of America. But in fact, it's an ethnographic study of the Narragansett Indians. So all the phrases which he transliterates are there that are all revolve, or each chapter might be around funeral practices, birthing practices, hunting, fishing rituals, currency, all that sort of stuff. So it paints a picture of the Narragansett Indians. He goes back to England, which is now in the middle of its civil war. He hangs out with Milton and Oliver Cromwell and publishes this book to great acclaim. It's a kind of a bestseller. Stays there for 2 years, gets the patent. It's the first one in the world that enshrines the notion of liberty of conscience, freedom of thought. And our notion of the separation of church and state comes from Roger Williams, and goes back to Providence and begins this experiment, what we like to call the experiment in liberty in America. So that's what I've been working on the last few years between writing poems. And so I guess you could say it continues the theme. Isn't it interesting that the man who was most responsible for us believing in the separation of church and state was himself the most devout believer. And that's what made him so insistent on separating church and state. He hated the fact that the Puritans had created a theocracy in the New World, and that hence his desire to stay away from them. But he does it out of the fervency of his own Christian belief rather than out of any secular notion. He believed that the church would be saved if it was separate from politics. It seems to me a lesson that some people on the right in the United States might do well to heed once again. Yeah. Can you hear this?
Oh, I just want
Here. Yeah.
Yes, here is right. And thank you. I just want to thank you so much for sharing that because I definitely want to read that book because I'd heard about Rhode Island as being one of the early havens for religious dissenters, right? It was just like anyone could come and the Puritan Massachusetts, they would like torture. And I don't know if they executed Quakers, but there was,
They did.
yeah, which is a part of history that we don't always hear of. So I just love your filling that in. Yeah.
And there's a great story about the Quakers because Williams's idea was you fight it out in the marketplace of ideas. You don't execute the Quakers. So toward the end of his life, there's a famous story that he actually didn't like the Quakers because in 17th century the Quakers were quite they were sort of rabble rousers, and they would run down the street naked, and they're
Right.
not at all the way we think of Quakers today. Um, so George Fox, who was the founder of the Friends in the New World, was coming to Newport, and Williams challenged him to a 3-day debate. And unfortunately, Fox had left by the time the news came to him. But Williams did debate three of his disciples over the course of 3 days. But what was interesting about it to me was that Williams is at this time he's 69 years old. He rows a boat 30 miles to Newport to debate these three Quakers. And then he rows back and has one more for one more day of debate. And then he writes about a 400-page book about how wrong the Quakers are and how right this is the right way to understand God. So I in my research for this book, which yes, to address the question in the chat, it's not finished yet. It's late. It's overdue. I tracked down a guy who builds replicas of 17th century boats, dories, and went to visit him to see if we could row from Providence to Newport. And I spent a couple of days training with him and his competitive rowers, and they were really fit, and I was really sore. But one morning he called me at 6 a.m. and said, "We have a favoring tide. I'll pick you up in 15 minutes." And we ended up going and rowing. I think we rowed altogether for about 13 or 14 hours to get to Newport, and it was so damn hard. And all I could think was that Roger Williams at 69, with probably a servant boy, just Williams and a servant boy, rode 30 miles, then debated 3 days straight with the Quakers who, they were heckling him during this time. They were saying, old man. But, Williams kept it up, and then rose back, and one more day of debate, and then this book. And, it's kind of a wild story. The other thing I would say is that he was also involved in two Indian wars in 1637, not long after he had arrived in Providence, the Pequot War, and interestingly, he maintained a friendship with John Winthrop throughout the rest of Winthrop's life, and he served as a kind of a spy for Winthrop to say, these are the Indians you want to side with. These are the Indians you don't want to side with. So he was a sort of interlocutor between the two, and he maintained that till the end of his life. He founded the Baptist Church in Providence, in the U.S., and after 3 months left the Baptist Church, and so he was essentially without a church by the end of his life. And toward the end of his life was the King Philip's War, in which Williams's house, Williams, the great friend to the Native Americans, his house was burned down, and most of his papers were destroyed. So, I look at Williams and I think here's a kind of counter history that we might have had: somebody who honored the Native position in the New World, befriended them, learned their languages, learned their ways, was always felt that they were completely equal to the English settlers. But of course, history went in a different direction. And I think part of my job as a writer is to resuscitate some aspect of this long buried history.
I look forward to that book.
So does my editor. I just flew home from Hong Kong yesterday, and among the emails I saw when I got off the plane in O'Hare was an editor, and it was message from my editor, where's this damn book?
Gee. Do you have a title for it yet, Christopher? Tentative title or?
The Trials of Roger Williams, a life. Yeah.
I'm
Fascinating.
interested in all of that. If it's my turn, about poetry, I just I think like Anne Hutchinson is one person who gets kicked out of the Massachusetts colony. I know there's a big statue of her on a pillar of some sort there in Providence. But the idea of poetry as prayer, it seems to involve a kind of receptivity, right? A kind of patient listening and receptivity. And I mean, I do love Emerson. And so I think, he talks about thinking, all thinking as a pious reception. And I actually have just been reading, the Book of Light. What's I'm blanking on her name now, but the wonderful African American poet, and Ross Gay writes the introduction to this anniversary edition, and it's also connected to this kind of transcendentalist openness. And when you talk about writing a 400-page disputatious book, I just think of the way in which receptivity and orthodoxy, if you will, or theological disputation are so, they kind of rub against the grain of each other. And I have been reading this new book by Maury Creech called The Sentence. And he's a very accomplished kind of formalist Christian poet. And I wonder how a satire is almost irresistible, it seems, rather than, I mean, there's a great patience with the language, but there's a kind of inner argument that's going on that seems rather abstract, and it seems kind of to be cutting off that receptivity and alertness to the world and attention to what may be coming through. These are just observations. I must also tell you that my older brother's name is Roger Williams, and my last name. And my grandfather was not by any means an educated man. He was had to leave school in the 8th grade, but he was a Baptist minister. And I think that my mother used to say that there was actually some connection to our family. I'll have to research that to prove it. I'm doubtful about that, but I think being a Baptist minister may lead to a sense of connectedness that may account for his name. But anyway, also just the idea of tutoring Milton and talking about freedom of the press. Of course, one of the ironies of Milton's great, Areopagitica is that the press is free to everybody. It's a powerful argument for freedom of the press, except for Catholics, of course, right?
Yeah.
So text or license, there's this openness, but then, you have to draw a line somewhere, right?
Well,
Anyway, I loved hearing all that. I wish you luck with the book, and I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, thank you. The funny thing about Williams is that when he published a key into the language of America when he arrived in 1643, and when he departed a couple of years later, he published a second book on the day that he left, which was called The Bloody Tenet of Persecution for Cause of Conscience. And it is a mammoth screed against really any sort of just any move to impose belief on beliefs on other people. And that book of in England in the middle of the Civil War was immediately condemned and burned at the stake by the public hangman. But Williams was halfway across the ocean by then.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think it also goes to the point where anything turns dogmatic, that's where, in my view, poetry wants to disappear, right, and or flee, and that was the case for Williams. Any sort of dogmatism made him really leery of what the actual intent was, because at the end of the day, as a poet, we never know. I love Milosh's idea that we have to pray that good angels, not evil ones, use us for their purposes, because in fact we don't know what the ultimate meaning of our words will be. But we pray that we're being used well and wisely.
I'd like you to speak, Christopher, if you can. I mean, when I was reading about you, I was just astounded by the fact of all of your outreach in the world. And one of the notions that I've coined, I think, is that the only nation I'm patriotic to is the imagination. That's my nation. That's the nation that I feel I truly belong to. But could you speak to that? I mean, how it is to kind of, in a sense, have experienced so much of the world and how that has affected your poetic practice?
Oh, what a good question! But I like that phrase. The only nation you subscribe to is the imagination. That's
Yeah.
yeah. I would pledge allegiance to that as well. Uh, well, I guess I would. The way I might answer it is that every fall I get to host 30 to 35 or 40 writers, distinguished writers from around the world who come to take part in our fall residency. And uh, every year, I tell people that I have a job that I can find out at almost every hour of the day how very little I know about the world, because each writer comes with a whole head full of ideas and books and issues and dreams that I get to learn something about. So I guess that would make it, I hope that what that does is make me a bit humble about ever having any certitude about anything, because I'll, in the next hour, somebody might come into my office to say, so tell me how to think about this. I'll give just one example. We had a wonderful writer some years ago, a novelist from Mauritius named Shanaz Patel. And she was she came to my program to finish a novel. And she said, and I said to her, so what is your novel about? And she said, oh, I'm writing about the Chagosian people. And I said, oh, what's that? What's that? And she said, well, she also worked as a journalist. Whenever you see a byline and it says Diego Garcia, and it has to do with U.S. or NATO jets going somewhere and dropping bombs and this and that, Diego Garcia is one of the islands, is one of the Chagosian islands, and the Chagosian people were given when Mauritius secured its independence in 1967, the same year that my program was founded. Among other things, the Brits did not give them back the Chagosian Islands so that they could secure them to create this large and vast mobile and Air Force base. And, countless dogfights and sorties have been launched from that place over the last 55 years and 56, 7 years. And Shanaz told me that the people were given 30 minutes to pack up their things and leave and go to Mauritius, where they would live the rest of their lives. They never went back to their land, and she had stumbled into them as a journalist and just did a little story about the Chagosians at some point, and then realized there was this whole community of people who'd lost everything. They even left behind their pet dogs and would never see it again. And that compelled her to start interviewing lots of people from the community and eventually to write a really terrific novel, the title of which I can't now remember. She writes in French and French Creole. It's been translated into English. And I thought, I've probably seen that byline, especially since I've covered, spent a lot of time in war zones, Diego Garcia, thousands of times in my life without ever giving it another thought. And then come to find out there's a whole history of a people who were forced from that land, a story that we know has been repeated countless times on every continent and for every nation. And yet one writer managed to go track down some of those people, interview them, and fashion their stories into a terrific novel. And so every time I hear a story like that, I think, okay, Mr. Know-it-all, you know really much less than nothing. So I think that I hope that those kinds of experiences with writers from around the world has helped me to maintain some kind of a sense of things. I just, as I said, returned from Hong Kong. My program, a writer in Hong Kong 20 years ago decided to create a program modeled after my program, the International Writing Program. They created the International Writers Workshop. So I was invited back to help them celebrate their 20th anniversary. And a lot of writers who've gone to our program have then gone on to the International Writers Workshop. So it was a sort of homecoming. There was one writer from Japan and another one from Paris, and it just, I was thinking about all of the different lives that they've had, and they stay in touch with the writers they were in residence with all those years ago. And what we do is create a sort of network of connections that endures over the years. And so I was sitting there watching all these writers who have come back and thinking about the writers I've hosted over the last 24 years, and it's been rich. It's given me new ways to think about the world on a, as I say, sometimes hourly basis.
I'd certainly like to hear you read more, Christopher. I'd love to hear something from Flares, and you could also talk to us a little bit about that book if it's accessible to you right now.
Yeah, let me. I should be able to find it. Well, how about I can read you something brand new with that that does have some prose in it, if that's okay, because I'm pretty excited about it actually. I had a friend who suggested writing an abecedarian. That's a poem with each line begins with the next letter of the alphabet. And I wrote such a thing, and I had so much fun writing it that I wrote a second one, and I liked that so much that I wrote a third one. So here's what this is called Abecedarians for the Apocalypse. And actually, and I should just say, I don't have it handy, but I'm just thinking the poet Richard Kenny once suggested to a class I was teaching, a workshop I was teaching, write a poem of 10 words in which each word has one letter more than the preceding word. And I thought, what a crazy idea that is. But then as I was driving home that night, I thought, let's see. I am the mare night forgot. And suddenly I was writing a poem called Three Horses. So I love those kinds of tricks. Anyway, Abecedarians for the Apocalypse. Allow me to explain my reasoning before you cut my throat with a scimitar caked with the blood of my friends and enemies. Do not ignore a condemned man's last words. Examine, if you will, what Hildegard found on her way to heaven, sainthood and glory in the hearts of her disciples. How spiritual warriors fight for their faith in the most inhospitable conditions judges and juries can devise for them, knockoffs inspired by Dante's Inferno, and why loving kindness must remain our watchword. Meh is the wrong reply to my request. No one will be absolved if you deny our fundamental right to liberty. Poor thing, you do not know what can be done. Question everything in your holy book. Render unto Caesar what you love. Short any stock you can, and pray for rain. The men and women sentenced to life in prison under review today should not require vetting, apologies, and credit checks, x-rays, or body scans, just charity. You hold the sacred key to the hereafter. Zero chance of a commutation, right? And here's the second one. This is in prose. A high official from the court was assigned to lead our tour of the underworld, which provoked more speculation about the sovereign's health. Basta, muttered the guides, idled by an edict they did not pretend to understand. Ciao Bella, whispered the palace guard to all the women in our entourage. Dusk came on before we could decide whether to stay or go, and so we stood at loose ends in the gathering darkness, shivering in the wind. Enter at your own risk, said the official, twisting the waxed tips of his mustache like candle wicks, pointing at the island in the middle of the lake from which rose the castle ruins. Fanning out across the beach like a militia recruited from the mountains, we climbed uncertainly into the boats and rowed across the water. Gone was our vaunted sense of moderation, the map that we had followed in our pursuit of happiness. For no sooner had we made landfall than we sprinted to a cave near the ruins, in which we found a marbled staircase descending into the earth. Halfway down, we stopped on the slipped steps to get our bearings, and from inside the wall, we heard a steady tapping, which led us to question again the nature of our mission, its secret provenance, its murky goals, the way it was portrayed to the town criers. Inevitably, someone claimed to see a ghost, which on closer inspection turned out to be a stalactite. Jesus Christ, the official said under his breath, a diplomatic lapse that caught us by surprise, though we said nothing. Khans might order caravans across the desert before we let on that anything was amiss. Long ago, on a mission to the ungovernable border region, we had learned a lesson about the virtue of silence, having misinterpreted a chieftain's slip of the tongue as the final word in the peace process, which led to even more fighting. Make no mistake, we were not tempted to go to war despite our opponent's scurrilous allegations on the eve of our departure, nor would we betray our ideals to appease the enemy. Our orders were clear: to avoid compromising situations which underscored the ambivalence we felt on our dark descent. Pity the note takers assigned to our strategy session the night before, the inconclusiveness of which had prompted the decision to spare no expense in our last attempt to salvage the mission. Queer as it may sound, we still believed the empire would never end. Resurrection was the theme, after all, and regardless of what befell us, as we intended to act as if nothing had changed upon our return. Summary justice would continue, also athletic contests and dance performances. Take heart, we told our security detail when we reached the waterfall at the bottom of the cave. Useless to cover our ears, the noise was deafening, or plot an escape. Victory was not an option, at least not in the short run. Where to go? Xenophobia had been our ministering angel for so long that we could not imagine another way to spell our fate. You cannot breathe a word of this to anyone. Zones of indifference were what we hoped to create, and we might yet succeed. That's probably enough. I'll let the third one go. But for me to write such things is a sort of surrealism in reverse. Just if you set some kind of crazy imperative on you, there's no telling what the imagination might spring up. So that's my pledge of allegiance for the day to the to the
Can
imagination.
you explain that very interesting term, surrealism in reverse? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, good question.
Well, I think in let's say a lot of surrealist operations depend upon automatic writing, the systematic derangement of the senses. But in this case, you're taking something as elementary as the alphabet. I'm going to go through all the letters of the alphabet. And now that I think of it, I realize that's the same move that happens in the 119th Psalm when you have every letter of the Hebrew alphabet there. So it's an ordering mechanism designed to reveal perhaps an essential disorder or chaos or entropy at the heart of the enterprise. That might be a way to describe it.
Mm, mm, mm.
Christopher, I wanted to ask, writing the Abecedarian, which is something I discovered a number of years ago and find really a wonderful, fun challenge. How did you find the effort or the discipline, the whatever you might call it? My late husband might have called it the dharma of moving from one line to the next line with the next letter of the alphabet. How did that, what kind of discoveries did you come upon as you had to improvise your way into the next line with the next letter of
Yeah.
the alphabet? Yeah.
Well, that's the whole game, isn't it? I mean, again, it short circuits your logical thought processes and forces you to find other answers. I have a friend long ago, the poet Gail Ronsky. We were talking about Louise Gluck's poems, and she said, "You know what I love about Louise's poems is that they appear to be employing a very simple diction. The language is rather plain." She said, "But if you look at it, you look hard at it, you realize that she rejected the first 5 or 6 words that came to her, right? And she would choose about the 7th or the 8th word. And I think that any poetic exercise that causes you to reject the first few things that occur to you, or cause you to inspire you to invent something, has a chance of getting us something that really counts, right? And so that's what I discovered. But I'm also somebody. If I'm given when I was a graduate student, I remember my classmates always groaning if the poet gave us an exercise, and I would groan too, just to sound like everyone. But secretly, I was thinking, I can't wait to go and try that, just to see what might come of it, right? So anything to get the imagination going. And for me, the Abecedarian, that did it. When a friend said that somewhere, I thought, oh yeah, I'll try that.
Mm. I love your conversation with Gail Ronsky and that assertion of searching for the right word. I actually often repeat to my students this line from Mark Twain, that the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and a lightning bug.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, I mean, if you could speak a little bit about your own process of revision, that would be great for us. Just to throw in one last thought before we hear your answer. In the art of revision, Peter Ho Davies kind of makes a real interesting, I would say, subversion of cliche, because he talks about the idea that most people say write what you know, and he said write to know, revise to know more, and then complete your revision to say this is what I now know. So any ideas about revision, things that you've either encountered from other great teachers or that you are now teaching yourself? Thank you.
I think what Peter wrote there is exactly right. I'm always writing toward what I do not know. I think when I over the years developed this idea that the worse the first draft of something is, the better chance I have of writing something something decent. And I think that for two reasons. One is partly I'm just terrified to think, oh my God, I just can't write anything. It's so terrible. But more to the point, if the language is cliched, if it's awkward, that's not necessarily a sign of dementia, though it increasingly begins to feel that way. It may be that I have stumbled onto something for which I have yet to find the language, because it's something that really matters to me. And so I think of revision as that's where all the fun begins for me. You know, you write a first draft, you like certain things in it, most things you don't like, but all those places where there are problems, that to me is that's where the game begins. And I've sometimes said to students, my first prose book was a book called The Grass of Another Country, A Journey Through the World of Soccer. I went and covered the World Cup in Italy in 1990 and then wrote a book about it. And when I remember when I turned it in to my editor, and I'd had this idea that if I write a page a day, every day, I can write a draft in 9 months, which I did. I sent it off to my editor. And this is pre-email. He said, he sent me a letter that said, it's obvious that you had a lot of fun in Italy. Now, what do you say we try to write a book? And I thought to myself, I just wrote a book. Yeah, yes, I did have fun, but I also wrote a book. And then what followed a few days later was the manuscript. Every single page was marked up with questions in the margins and words and phrases and sentences circled. And you know, my heart just sank when I looked at it. But the minute I started to try to address those issues, I was just so excited again. And I realized he'd given me this wonderful gift, which was to open up the process for me and to point to places where, for various reasons, laziness, exhaustion, uh, whatever, what have you, I had yet to figure out what it was I was trying to write about. So I took that as a kind of model for what I would do moving forward as a writer, just to look hard at what I've written, see the places that seem not to be working, not to try not to be afraid to admit to myself that it's not working, and then to start digging again. And that's the way I've kind of moved forward. I was thinking also, just in connection to this. I once heard Phil Levine during a reading say that the reason the reason he liked to read new work in his readings was so he could figure out who he had stolen lines from, which is to say, he would, in the act of reading it, he would realize, oh, that wasn't my line. That was, that was Mark Strand's line or image, and he wouldn't say anything up at the podium, but he would go back the next day and say, oh, I've got to work harder on that. So I'm always looking for those little hints that something I've done is not up to snuff. I haven't really addressed the issue, or I have unconsciously borrowed something from somebody else. Those are the things I try to keep in mind. And I know it just as a general matter, if I can't, even if I think I've typed up a final version of it, if I can't stop looking at it, then I know that something is still off. And I don't know what it is yet, but I'll keep at it until I just can't bear it anymore. So,
And Christopher, do you hold to this notion, Paul Valéry, that the poem is never finished, only abandoned, or how do you respond to that?
well, I've quoted that line thousands of times in my life, but I do think, yeah, it's just there are some that you abandon, but I'm working on poems now that I started 20 years ago. When the book that we started with here, I started that in 2006, and it came out now at the end of 2023. And for many years, I didn't have anything, didn't add a word to it, but I keep files and drafts of everything that seems to me to have some life, and I'm always hoping at some point now I see how to write that. And that partly comes out of once having had the good luck to see an exhibit of Elizabeth Bishop's papers and looking at her first drafts. The first drafts of poems like The Moose or The Bite, I looked at and I remember thinking, gee, whatever made her think that those were going to turn into two of the most important poems of our time, right? And because her first drafts were often nothing to write home about, but she knew something was there. And so I think of the fact that she published a total of 101 poems in 50 years of writing is a testament to her patience and her perseverance, but her sense that if she kept looking at it and moving words around, sentences around, eventually what would emerge would be worth keeping, and that surely has been the case.
I'm so glad you bring up that topic, Christopher. We had Carolyn Forche a month or two ago, and one of the things that came up was something I had discovered through reading another interview with her prior to her appearance on Poetry Junkies. And that was the fact that she had not intended to include the Colonel in her book, The Country Between Us. It was a total accident. It basically, she had given the manuscript
That
to
was a good discussion.
to a Yeats scholar that she knew, and the Yeats scholar got back to her and said, "Well, that's an amazing collection. You got to publish it, and the best poem in there is the Colonel." And she said, "What do you mean the Colonel? Oh, that slipped in there." And so basically, her most renowned work was something she nearly just put in the drawer. And it's been haunting me because I'm wondering maybe the work that I've would be known for is just rotting in some old notebook of mine because I didn't recognize that that's where the real genius lies. Do you have anything to say?
What a great story! I'd never heard that. But I feel like I've heard stories like that often enough to think that it's yet more proof that we don't really have much control over the destiny of what we write and read. We hope we try to do it as well as we can, and then at some point the Colonel becomes the poem that everybody is talking about, even though we may at the time have thought, it's not my best thing, and I can let that one go. I take heart in hearing that story.
Yeah. I hope, Christopher, you can make it to Prague. I'm guessing you've already been here before, right?
I absolutely love Prague. I taught for a couple of summers in the Prague writing seminars, and I can tell you I took my daughters there when they were very little, and they were thrilled. The thing they loved most about being in Prague was that there was an exhibit of Barbies at that museum at the castle, and so and how much they grew to love goulash. So that's Prague for them. Now that they're both adults, it might be time to go back with them, just see what else they might discover there. I just love Prague. Yeah.
I was
Oh, please, please.
Oh,
Elizabeth.
yeah. Well, Christopher, I would so love this conversation. And Lucian, thank you. And Lisa and everyone. It's just so great. And, as you were talking, Christopher, I just got excited just listening to you talk and read and think about language and just thinking about how, like, I don't know how you feel about it, but I always think I read to take me beyond language to something beyond language, or if I feel that I want to find language for it, but it doesn't come straight on. It's like it comes in a way like, oh, who thought that combination of words created this spark, right? And I don't know, I just love to hear you talk anything else about that, about what is it that we want or looking for, or I mean, I'm sure it's different things different times, but uh yeah, what gets you the most excited about poetry?
Yeah. Well, it's such a good question and impossible to answer. And what I'll say is that I remember when I was in graduate school, I stumbled in a used bookstore on Michael Benedict's anthology of French Surrealist poets. And it happened to be at a time that I was quite sick. I had just discovered a tumor in my neck, and I was at that point thinking, well, I'm not even, I'm in my early 20s and it's already over. And I found those poems by Andre Breton and Paul Eluard, and I just thought that, whatever time I have left, I want to read these poems, and I want to try some of these surrealist exercises just to see if I can get outside of my conventional ways of thinking. And I eventually, I got well. I translated a couple of books by a book that Charles Eluard and Breton wrote together, and then a book, Charles' last book of prose poems, Constellation. And I think I was always in some way trying to find out what the surrealists were looking for, that dream point where that point where dream and reality might merge, which is another way of saying they were trying to understand something about how the imagination works, and they were trying to tap into the deepest recesses of our memory and imagination. And I think that most of what I've tried to do as a writer is to map some of those places as well. And that's why two words come together in a funny way, and you might be on your way to a poem, right? I mean, that's what I'm always kind of listening for.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, do you think does that speak to you a little bit about the healing power of poetry? Because that's a field I'm gaining interest in, is poetry therapy.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that there's always an interesting relationship between the healing and the literary arts, isn't there? I mean, when you think about doctor writers like Chekhov, Keats, or William Carlos Williams, and I have a lot of doctors on my mother's side of the family, so I've always been intrigued about the ways in which a doctor a doctor is on the one hand trying to diagnose something, but they're also trying to understand something in their patients about the story that a patient tells or presents. So the marriage of storytelling and healing arts is, I think, a profound one. I know that in my own life, uh, if the day goes by that I'm not didn't try to write at least a little something, I'm just really anxious. And I know that the practice of writing seriously for a long period of time makes it an integral part of your metabolism. So there is some piece of that that goes along with the healing. And of course, when terrible things happen, some of us turn to poetry to read and sometimes to write. Think about how after 9/11, on September 1st, 1939, was being traded repeatedly in internet chat rooms and the like. People saying, "Oh, Auden wrote that poem in preparation for a day like this," although he was talking about the Second World War. And I've always believed that poetry can help us can help us live our lives to some extent, and particularly in those dark moments when everything goes south.
I'm so glad you brought up Auden because I was thinking of his "Mad Ireland Hurt You into Poetry,"
Yeah.
and also, of course, this very, in a way, contentious phrase that poetry makes nothing happen. And if you could speak a little bit to the way you do see poetry making things happen, because you are a very politically in my estimation, active poet.
Yeah. Well, but remember, that's not the last word that Auden had on it. He said poetry is a way of happening. It's a mouth. And that's the way in which it is. It doesn't make things happen. It doesn't change a political argument necessarily, but it makes possible a different understanding of one's relationship to the issue at hand. W.S. Merwin said to me once that I had the good luck to house sit for him for four springs back in the early 90s. So I'd come back from the Balkans where I was war reporter, go to Merwin's house with all the palms growing in Maui. It was, I said, it's a dirty job, but somebody has to do it. And he said to me once something I've always treasured. He said, you know, we wrote a lot of bad poems against the war during the Vietnam era. He said, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have written them. And I've always thought that's good. I mean, he recognized that maybe they weren't the best poems that he wrote, but the act of paying attention to that sharpened his thinking. Maybe the poems didn't work out, but that act of attention that a poem can be has meaning. So I'm always thinking that my job is to remain alert, open, willing to try to consider what a poem can do in a particular moment. I have no illusions that On the Road to Lviv is going to change anything in the ways in which, whether we arm the Ukrainians or not. But I think there is something to be said for trying to attend to the gravity of the situation, and if possible, to find some words for it that might make some small difference in somebody's life.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. The power of what is said. I mean, in the current context, I just feel like we are beset by so many slogans. And an observation that I found, Christopher, is that a slogan is a slow gun. And no matter how shiny the barrel is, it's going to eventually blow your head off.
Yeah.
Could you speak to that?
I think you're exactly right. And look, I follow. I'm on Twitter as much as anybody, and there was a time early on that I thought that certain comedians on Twitter would save us. But the fact of the matter is all so much language around us, from the sloganeering of politicians, of commentators on social media. The sloganeering is not going to save us. It may move things in one direction or another, but what you want, as I want, as a reader, as a writer, is I want depth, and that's the way to find depth. Is not going to be in a slogan. It's not going to be in a clever tweet that goes viral. It's more likely to come about in somebody's poem that came out of nowhere, right? So that's why I'm always trying to think about when in the midst of being overwhelmed by the sloganeering and the political talk, especially now, I'm more and more eager to read really good poets and see what they're doing. They will force me to stay on my tiptoes, right? So remember how Thoreau said you have to read as if on tiptoes. That's what I think poetry demands of us, and it's much easier to just watch MSNBC or turn to Twitter. But for our soul health, it might be wise to, as I'm doing these days, I'm reading Diane Seuss's new book, Modern Poetry, which is just fantastic. And you know, when I get tired of Twitter, I turn back to Diane Seuss, and all is well in the world, or at least in my little part of the world.
Yeah, that's where literature is news. This day's news seems so relevant. You know,
Yeah,
because that is true. That you know, even the war in El Salvador is finished, but the kernel is going to be read in 100 years, 1,000
exactly. Yeah,
years. It's relevant.
exactly.
It's relevant.
Yeah. Oh, I like John.
Could you
What you're
say a
saying
little
about
bit more about Diane? Could you say just a little
I,
bit more about Diane Seuss? This is
yeah,
Dawn. Diane Seuss,
yeah,
because I'm very immersed in the Frank sonnets, and I just love to get,
they're
you
fantastic.
know, some of your take.
I love those Frank sonnets, and I love that skirmish on Twitter just a couple of weeks ago, kicked up by somebody saying, "Why is this a sonnet? It's just prose." Well, in the Frank sonnets, she just takes us through so many different ways of thinking about what a sonnet can be, and now in modern poetry, I'm just reading the title poem, and it's. She has this uncanny ability to mix uh, the highest register of the language with the lowest, uh, contemporary slang, crazy memories, but with the most complex thought. It's kind of wild what she does, and I've been. That's what I was reading when I wasn't watching movies on the flight back from Hong Kong yesterday, and.
Huh,
Uh,
great.
I can't remember. I can't remember the movies I watched, but I can remember Diane Seuss invoking Theodore Retke in the middle of a poem, and what she's learning from Retke. I thought, oh my God, what a thing to do! Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, that works.
Great.
And Don, I
Thank you.
loved you just mentioned, I think in the chat, something about Christian Wyman. I'm reading his new book, which is fantastic. The 50 uh, dispatches against despair, or 50 poems against
Isn't he?
despair. It's
He's unbelievable, and he has suffered with, a ticking time bomb in his
yeah,
body for
yeah,
most of his adult life, and he has absolutely earned everything he has to say
without a doubt.
about despair and hope.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a really great book. A really great book. Yeah.
I don't know his work. I'm so sorry to admit that, but can you tell me what I should read of his? If
Well,
I've
I
never,
would start with this new book. It's 50 pretty short chapters, and he's talking about you could say it's a kind of an autobiography in poems, in his reading of other people's poems, but he's talking about he was diagnosed with this very rare kind of cancer that he has that should have killed him a long time ago, but it hasn't. And he's continued writing through it all, married, kids, and so with that ticking time bomb, as John rightly said, it puts a premium on everything that he does and writes and reads. So you know that this is not somebody who wastes his time on Twitter arguments about whether Diane Seuss's Frank sonnets are sonnets or not. he's he knows time is short, so he's not going to waste it on arguments. Lucian mentioned Twain. I saw this line of Twain's just yesterday that I love. It's useless to argue to dumb down your an argument to somebody because then you're arguing at their level and they have much more experience.
You suddenly went mute, Christopher. Don't know why.
Am I still?
Now you're okay, but if you could repeat that Twain quote.
Well, the Twain quote is, "It's useless to dumb down your argument to argue with someone because they have much more experience arguing as a dumb person than you do." And that, Twain says it in a much more memorable fashion, though. But
That's a great quote.
I would say also the first book I started with and did a review for, I guess, the Library of America that I absolutely adore is Ambition and Survival. And it's
yeah,
essays, but it's got a lot about how he came to poetry, sitting on a roof, reading Milton, and from I think I can't remember if he's from East Texas or West Texas, but definitely the boonies where you might get sniped off your roof, and if anybody saw Paradise Lost in your hand, and it's just fascinating essays, highly literary essays with autobiographical detail.
Yeah, yeah, it's a terrific book, and his poems are really equally fine. He was the editor of Poetry Magazine for some years, so he's exceedingly well read, and but he's also charming on the page. I mean, he's not highfalutin in any way. And
So one of my favorite poems of all time from anyone is Five Houses Down. I think it was in the New Yorker, but I know you can Google it and find it. Take a look at that if you want to get an idea of that charm that he has, as well as, just mastery of the vernacular, and extremely moving. It's, also one of the best things I've read about being a man, being a young man. And, it's really worth looking at as an entree, I think, into Chris Wyman.
yeah,
Thank you so much for that, Dawn. Really appreciate you bringing that to our attention. I'm going to post a link to everyone of Five Houses Down, which I did quickly find. Maybe kind of in closing, do you want to give us a recommendation of a poet who you think will send shivers through our lives?
what a good question. Well, um, I'm surprised that I've made it this far into the talking about poetry without mentioning my closest friend of 20 years was Aga Shahed Ali, whose collected poems is titled The Veiled, Veiled Suite. Shahed was a remarkable poet, Kashmiri American poet, who passed away, alas, at far too young of the brain cancer. But he's one of those poets who, once you've read him, you won't look at the world the same. He's also the poet who, as he said, who challenged American poets to write real ghazals in English. And Agashahidali. Very funny poet, but a deeply moving poet. And in light of the war in Gaza, he translated 11 poems by Mahmoud Darwish, the great Palestinian poet, and you can see many ways in which his own poems later in his life are in conversation with a number of terrific poets, including both Darwish, the Palestinian poet, and Yehuda Amichai, the Israeli poet who wrote in Hebrew. So Shahid he was one of a kind.
Yeah, he was amazing. He was amazing. He was a wonderful, wonderful man, just full of joy, full of joy.
Yeah.
And I think I met him the same time I met you, which
Yep,
was in
at Red Lodge.
Utah at that, what was it called? It was like in the mid 80s. And
Oh,
Shahid was
no.
still wearing those Oshkosh cover overalls.
Yeah.
And he was just,
Yeah.
and then you helped to, I think it was at the Palm Springs AWP in like 2001 when he only had a few months to live at that point. And you got everybody to contribute a line to a ghazal in his honor. And that
We
was
did
amazing. Yeah.
Marty Williams was Marty came up with the idea that because Shahid had a line that said theoretically a ghazal can go on forever, and so we began with a ghazal that he and I, when I was house sitting for Merwin at one point, and I knew we talked on the phone every day, sometimes many times a day, and I could tell we were going to have a long conversation. So I went to make a cup of tea, and I said to Shahid and I called Merwin's place the Promised Land, and Merwin, as a rather devout Buddhist, that place was in some ways rather spare, and I I went to make a cup of tea and I said to Shahid, "Oh, there's no sugar in the promised land." And he said, "Oh, that's a great opening line for a guzzle. Let's try to figure it out. How will we close it?" And we came up with swear by the olive in the God-kissed land. So we began the guzzle with that couplet and closed it with Shahid's signature couplet to the poem that he ended up writing for me called Land. And it has his name in my my guzzle for him closes with using the you name yourself in the last line, and I said, "Will this Christ bearer, Christopher in Greek is Christopheros, Christ bearer, will this Christ bearer find his only friend in blessed Shahid's land, in the promised land, in blessed Shahid's land?" So, in a way, in my couplet for him, I got to name both of us, and that's and then I know Carolyn, we had more than 100 poets contribute couplets to that guzzle that was then published in Ratapalix.
Ratapalix, yes. I think I still have a copy of that. I kept
Oh
it.
my God!
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
you're lucky. Yeah, yeah.
I didn't have a line in there, but I wanted to keep that because it was such a tribute to him, and he was just a
Yeah.
man who
You
passed
know,
way too early.
he in that anthology he did of guzzles, ravishing disunities. Bill Matthews wrote 8 guzzles, and at the end of his life, Heather McHugh wrote a bunch of guzzles. It was really something he gave a lot to all of us, and was a great friend. He was also my older daughter's godfather, and she was christened by my uncle, my godfather, who's an Episcopal priest, and my wife said to him afterwards, "You know, Shahid, you had to say you believe in a lot of things that."
Oh, you
Oh,
went
Christopher,
mute.
you hit your mute button.
Yep.
I'm just holding up Ravishing Disunities, my copy,
Yeah,
which I got
yeah.
back then. Yeah. I've taught from this. I've taught this book, or I've taught when I've taught the ghazal, I've used this book. So, yeah.
It's a great book, isn't it? It's a
Yeah.
really great book. So what I was going to say, so my wife said to him afterwards, "So you had to say that you believe in a lot of things that as a Shia Muslim must be a little complicated." And Shahid said, "Oh, I take it all very metaphorically." Which is, maybe that's the theme of everything we've been talking about today.
Yeah.
Christopher, perhaps in closing, I thank you so much for this time that you're spending with us. I was hoping to put together in Prague, as part of my festival moving center, having some poets from Palestine and poets from Israel read together. But one Lebanese poet I reached out to, who knows Palestinian poets, he said they won't even be in the same anthology as Israeli poets at the moment. I mean, where and what can we do in a world where even poets are not able to be tender with one another? What Speak to us, and hopefully with some of your experience, and maybe give us something to give us a perspective moving forward. Thank you.
Well, it's really complicated now, and it is the case that it's funny. I had a phone call not long after the war began uh, from an Egyptian Canadian novelist who was in daily conversation with an Israeli playwright, and they wanted to figure out a way to have bring Israeli and Palestinian writers together for conversations for something we might call what the day after will look like. And I liked what he was saying. I brought it up with our program officer at the State Department. They all like the idea, but I think there's a general recognition that that's impossible right now. In the same way that it's impossible to get Russian and Ukrainian writers on the same stage or anthology together. That which is grievous to me because my program is predicated on the idea that we bring people together to have conversations, difficult as they may be. it may be that such conversations won't be possible until the shooting stops. But I think that after the shooting stops, at some point, those difficult conversations will be absolutely necessary if there's any hope of finding ways to live alongside one another. But in the short term, what we do is we write as well as we can about it. We try to pressure our Congress people to do the right things, to uh, whether in Ukraine provide funds for them, whether in Gaza to get humanitarian supplies to Gaza, get the Israelis to stop dropping bombs so relentlessly. But we're in one of those really dark points in history, and I guess what I keep in mind is that Emily Dickinson wrote 400 poems in that dark year of 1862 when it looked as if the Union might fail. And Walt Whitman was becoming a radically different kind of poet through his nightly visits to the hospitals to write letters home for the wounded soldiers, usually Union soldiers, but sometimes Confederates. Writers do what they do in such dark moments. They bear witness as well as they can, and hope that in a more peaceful time they might be able to connect with those on the other side in an open-hearted way. That's what the writing, the daily writing life, I suspect can bring us to.
And how much do you think we can actually or should engage with the news when it's so bleak? I mean, it makes me think of Kafka's diary entry for Sunday, August 2nd, 1914. Germany has declared war on Russia, swimming in the afternoon. It's his only mention of the war in all his diaries.
Well, think about Dickinson doesn't mention the war once in those poems in 1862, but they are drenched in the war, right? You can feel the war all around her. Whitman is much more upfront. In fact, he writes that wonderful prose book, Memoranda, written during the war. So there are different ways. Whitman obviously was engaging with it and with every fiber of his being all day long. Dickinson in Amherst is engaging with it in a different way, and so my hunch is that every poet will do it differently, whatever suits them best. Merwin, for the last 30 years of his life, he was consumed with thinking about the environmental crisis, and as he said, that's where his attention went. But he also wrote some of the most gorgeous love poems to his last wife, Paula. They're in there, and you find your own amount of attention to pay to whatever it is you have to attend to. I happen to attend to a lot of the political stuff because I have a job that I've got to be conversant with the issues going on all around the world, and it's also is the case that I'm interested in those subjects. So if that shapes my writing, then that's partly a function of that.
Oh, thank you so much, Christopher. I really do feel that I'm going to be reflecting on so many of the things you brought to us today, and the poets that you mentioned. And I'm so grateful to be now having to dive into Ravishing Disunities and many other volumes, which you just hinted at. So thank you again. And if anyone else wants to say any closing words of thanks, please jump in.
Christopher, I I could I would love to make a few recommendations of people, poets and writers you might want to invite for the International Writing Program.
Yeah.
I guess I can find your contact data on the Iowa, University of Iowa International Writing Program website.
Yeah, it's Christopher-Merrill at uiowa.edu. And I'm always looking for recommendations of writers.
Yeah, that'd be great.
We're right now just selecting for the next presidency. We have that meeting on Monday.
Oh, okay. Okay. I was listening too hard to copy down but I'm sure it's on the website.
Yeah, Christopher-Merrill at uiowa.edu.
UI. Oh, just U Iowa. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's easy. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Yeah. That's
I
great.
just want to say thank you so much.
Thank
This
you so
was
much.
fantastic, and I'm so glad you showed up when I forgot to remind you yesterday. I was like in a panic this morning, like, "Oh my God, I forgot to remind him. What if he doesn't show up?" Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
What a wonderful
Yeah,
discussion.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you, Lucian,
Yeah.
for hosting this,
Thank you.
and Lisa, and just everybody involved, everybody who's attended it. Christopher, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Be well.
Be well. We'll be in touch.